It's January 13th, 2010 at the Glenview Public Library. We're here with Kenneth Daniels, who was born September 12th, 1919. The interviewers are Phil, Laura, and Edson, working for the Veterans Oral History Project. Mr. Daniels served in the Marines from 1941 to 1945 in the South Pacific. Did you enlist or were you drafted?
It's a little story with it. First of all, I was born in July. Did you say born?
Yes, sorry. Oh.
I was born in July.
Oh, sorry. That looked like a 9 to me.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
all right. Then I was working. I couldn't afford to go to college because of the Depression. My father was cut back 50% on his salary. He had a good job, but it was gone. And I had 1 year of college pumping gas for 25 cents an hour, fitting shoes on Saturdays for 25 an hour. So that's how I got along, and I finally got a job as an accountant. And then I was working for Swift and Company, packing company, as an accountant. And along comes a draft, and the bill passed the U.S. Senate in 1940 in the fall. It was reiterated in the spring of 1941. So my draft number was low at that time. They put everybody's number in some kind of a sequential arrangement into a lottery. And they call it the squirrel cage, and they revolved that, and they picked out the numbers. Mine was very low. So I was told that I had to report at a certain time, and I did, and I decided to jump it a little bit and enlist in the Marine Corps, first of all, to see if I could take the Marine Corps. And secondly, I wanted to get 1 year and 1 day over with in service, which would be in the reserve, USMCR. That way I could fade out, come back to my job. So I went to San Diego for boot camp, and it was 13 weeks. In the fall, I went out there in September. I think it was 14th September 41. I went by train, entered boot camp, and it was in San Diego, and I then matriculated through that for 13 weeks, peeling potatoes in the mess hall. And I came back one day after a 3 o'clock adventure with potatoes in the morning, and about 10 o'clock San Diego time comes the barracks radio, one tiny little radio up on a shelf. And we're informed that the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor. So most of us knew we'd be in there for a while. So I finished that duty peeling potatoes for the recruit people, and then I was assigned to a unit of mostly Marines that were professional Marines who had been in the American enclave in Shanghai, China. The Japs had overrun that area, and they had to get out, just like the British and anyone else. Japanese drove everybody out. And so these were all professionals that were in the Marine Corps for 15, 20 years in some cases. And I joined that group, and it was a pack howitzer outfit. It was artillery. Pack howitzers, a 75 millimeter cannon. Perhaps when you see the 4th of July celebration on the square in Washington, you see these small cannon firing. That's a pack howitzer. So I had strep throat by that time, and I was advised I could either stay in the base hospital or go with my unit. So I went with my unit, but I went into sick bay on the troop ship. Now, I don't know how much detail you want about. There were 3 Matson liners, which had been in civilian service in the South Pacific, and they had a wonderful time. People could afford to go on those, but here we were assigned. There was six of we ordinary enlisted men to a stateroom. We had all the servants and all the servers and all the other personnel serving us, because it was only a few days after we knew we were going to be in a war. So it was too bad that we had to be in that kind of a setting, because we drag our machine guns and cars through the corridors, our beautiful walnut panels. It just hurt me to see the gouging it took, and it was never quite the same, I'm sure, after we left. But it was an emergency. Now, I could tell you about submarine attacks and so forth if you want to know, if it's too much detail.
Well, what were some of the first feelings that went through you, some of the people that you were with, when you found out that Pearl Harbor had been attacked?
Well, I knew that it was going to be more than 1 year and 1 day. I knew I would serve much longer than that. And the other thing that happened after we had our first submarine attack, and I could tell you about the number of ships that were with us and describe their function, was that I figured I wasn't likely to come back, because here were 250 million people that had no military training. Behind me, I had mine, but there were very few. There was only one combat division in the Marine Corps, and I was in it. So my feelings were that I would probably not come back, and I think I persevered longer and better by doing that. In other words, I don't think I anguished over it because I just gave up any thought of getting back. But I thought I'd enjoy what I could of my life and my buddies and so forth, and we'd shoot the breeze and talk about old times back home. A lot of yarns that were spun, and that's the way it was. The ones that didn't do that might have had a more difficult time, like committing suicide. That's it.
Did you know anybody that was at the base in Honolulu, or anybody that had been going through boot camp there?
No, so
Where exactly did you go in the South Pacific, or where did you see combat?
exactly our three Matson liners, the Monterey Mansonian. I was aboard the Lurline, Lurline, went directly under convoy of the aircraft carrier Yorktown, and 3 destroyers, and I'm sure we had some companion submarines. And after the attacks we had along and watching the aircraft take off the aircraft carrier and dropping charges on a suspected submarine, and seeing the destroyers throw ash cans, why, that also reinforced that was really where I realized that I probably wouldn't be likely to come back. On the other hand, I didn't like the idea of the Japanese attacking us or anybody else. I mean, I had no right to do that, and they were going to take time out of my life, probably hurt some of my companions and buddies, which they did. And I didn't like the idea, so I guess you might say I just rose up in opposition. That's basically an answer.
Oh, if you could sum up your job or your assignment throughout your service career, what would it be?
I was, at the beginning, a lowly private. You can't get any lower than that unless you go to the brig. And I was a machine gun jockey. And I operated a 50 caliber machine gun protecting the artillery. The artillery were the pack howitzers. And most of these howitzers were operated by these China Marines that had come because they'd been assigned to that, and that's what they were doing in China. Although they didn't fire them against any enemy, but that's what the function was. And we went from that point, from where I just left off, to American Samoa. And that's American Samoa, not British Samoa. And our 3 troop ships pulled into Pago Pago Harbor. And we were met when we got on land by the Samoan Marines. They were a militant and militia force. It had been loosely organized, and they wore lava skirts, and they wore the uniform up here, but then they had a skirt on underneath. It was a little bit different. And they were the protective force against whoever might come to take over there. Now, by the way, this is the island in which just a disaster happened not long ago with an earthquake out in the ocean at Tsami. I'm sure it wiped out some of the villages I'd been in, but I don't know that for sure. Got to Samoa and loaded the ships. My group was assigned to a village of Samoans, and I could tell you from then on. You want to know more about that part?
Absolutely, sure.
We had gotten there and we pulled in, and here were all these Samoans in thatch huts. And that's with the thatch on the top, and then they had these bamboo curtains that would come down in bad weather, and they had a rock floor, and they wove cocoa mats to go over the rock, and that's what they laid down on and sat on. So there was a high talking chief there, and I wrote up a little skit last Saturday, not even thinking I would use it here, but I got to thinking about it. I guess all this has generated some thoughts. And I wrote up a parody of Tina, who was the daughter of the high talking chief. I have pictures of her separate from all this, if you want to see them. And you tell me what you want, because I don't want to force anything upon you.
Oh, well, we'd love to hear any experiences that you feel free of talking about. You had mentioned Guadalcanal as one of the battles that you fought against.
That was the first one.
The first one. Could you explain what that battle entailed, or some specifics that you saw, or some experiences that you had?
Yes,
there?
and now that there's a lot of detail on things that happen on the island of Samoa that you might want to just pass over, and that's fine with me. So you want to go right on to Guadalcanal?
Well, if you have anything about the Samoa Islands, I didn't know that you did.
Well, actually, I had written up a little synopsis or sequence of what I thought you might be interested in, but I don't know how much time that you got, and I really don't want to spend any more time than you can use.
We've got about another half an hour.
Pardon me?
We've got about another half an hour for this entry.
Oh, well, I'm going to have to skip some of this then.
Okay.
I was in, the identification of the outfit was A110, Battery A, 1st Battalion, 10th Marine. Now, this was the beginning of the 2nd Marine Division. We were called the 2nd Marine Brigade, and that's how insufficient we were in manpower. There's only one combat division, 2 training camps, San Diego and in North Carolina. And the recruiters across the land, and that's all it was. And Camp Pendleton, which is still there. I hope they don't abandon that. And that's where we went for rifle training north of San Diego. So anyway, I'm going to skip a lot of that. I was in the 2nd Marine Brigade, attached to the 1st Marine Division. I was a machine gun jockey, and the balloons had been launched by submarines, and the San Diego people were now very friendly, where they hadn't been before. It reminded me of Rudyard Kipling, and I don't know if you remember ever reading this or not, about Johnny, the British soldier who's ignored in peacetime, but when things get bad, then the public looks at him, Johnny do this, Johnny do that. That's what it reminded me of. Let's see, we unloaded the ships, and we were short of ammunition. I only got to fire a short round out in the ocean to take my turn. We didn't have ammunition. The equipment we had was all World War I. It was all pulled out of the grease they call Cosmoline. My Springfield 03 rifle shooting 30 caliber round. I still remember the serial number, 320234, had been pulled out of World War I reserves. Our French 75s we had started with, all World War I, and they'd been pulled out of storage. They had the steel wheels, the wood with the steel, and they'd overturn the sand when they pull them behind the Jeep. So all this was replaced finally before we left for Guadalcanal with the pack howitzers quickly. So that's about the story there. I had a lot of things like how we put a machine gun nest on top of a hill, but I don't think you got time for that. We got to Guadalcanal. We unloaded under fire. Guadalcanal was in the British Solomon Island. And it was heavily occupied, of course, by the Japanese. They built an airstrip that we later took and called Henderson Field. It's still called that. And we unloaded Higgins boats. At that time, Higgins boats, they were made in New Orleans, as you probably know. Uh, they didn't have the unloading device in the front, we just piled over the side. Then we carried the box of ammunition and the supplies and the food and so forth ashore and piled them up, and we were under fire from artillery in the hills. And I was always glad I wasn't on the ship because it was still loaded with ammunition. If any of those rounds had hit the ship, why, it'd be pretty severe. We went into the island. You want to hear the rest of this?
Yeah.
We went into the island, and were firing our howitzers at the Japanese. And I was in a foxhole in a forward position with my buddy Charlie from Houston. And we had to put a sock on one hand and keep the other for trigger finger. And wake up after my shift, we'd take turns in the foxhole all night. And my hand was so swollen with mosquito bites, I could not bend it. So eventually we'd take Phil's naphtha soap, which was prevalent at that time, and wipe a thick layer, and I'd take the sting out. The first night out, someone I thought highly of, I went through boot camp, his name was Pancho. He's the first Hispanic I'd ever known. I came from Iowa where there weren't any of them. And he was sent as a runner in the dark, and a lieutenant in our outfit shot him through the belly, thinking he was a Jap. And I'm sure glad I didn't get involved in that one on either side. Those things happen. That's what they call collateral damage. So we fired our howitzer, and we'd shoot machine guns into the dense foliage, just like that wall over there. You would know if there's anybody in there. And then we get the sniper fire in the tops of the coconut tree, and there's a picture on that disc, and there's one in there that shows a sniper jacket. They have these fronds that look like coconut, and they're up in the trees. These snipers were, they'd be firing at us, and we couldn't seem to find them. And one of our sergeants had been active in China and was familiar with it. He took one of our machine guns and chopped the tops right out of 4 or 5 coconut trees and took care of the sniper. It's just the power of the 50 caliber is almost unbelievable. I'd still use that in U.S. forces. By the way, that was also the paramount weapon in the aircraft later on during the war. Let's see, that's Guadalcanal, but I don't know what else you want to hear. We kept marching and firing and fighting mosquitoes and occasional malaria bout in the field hospital. I had 9 hospital cases of malaria altogether. And you'd shiver and groan and take aspirin. We used Atirbin, which is a pill you took to try to prevent it, did no good at all. And used aspirin, even took liquid quinine. I just said aspirin, I meant quinine. Took liquid quinine out of Australia. That was the only thing that was available. Our pills were not available. And it did, I think, keep me from going into disaster. I was lucky to have the benign type and not the bulbar type. The bulbar type would constrict your throat and you couldn't breathe. So let's see, what else? Well, we're there for, let's see, 3.5 months. And sometime in February, we secured the island. That's Navy talk, by ending the combat and saying that we had won. And I don't know, I have a little ditty to tell you about there. Go ahead. So I was cleaning up our firing base, helping clean it up. Got down to the beach late, and I was glad I did, because the Japanese had fired torpedoes from their submarines and maybe some other vessels into ships, into our ship area, and they'd miss sometimes, and the torpedoes come up on the land. And then our guys would tap those, whoever was down there, and I think by the way, there was Army aboard the island and doing their share, but not very many. But then they came and took over from the Marines, and then we go on to the next island. And the Army did their share, I'm sure, but the Army boys would tap those. That's where we got the, we call it torpedo alcohol. I'm glad I didn't know about it because my friend Delkus from Chicago had imbibed a little too much. He got down there on the shore waiting the troop ship to take us away before I did, and he went out of his mind. So we had to stuff him in a truck, and I held him down. It was about 6'2", so it was a little problem for me until we got to the aid station. They gave him a shot of morphine, he vomited, and then he was okay. The other thing that happened might be interesting, I think it's just
I
meant.
don't understand. They tapped
That was propellant for the torpedoes. Alcohol,
okay, so
propellant.
the torpedoes, the Japanese torpedoes still had propellant in them, and they tapped the propellant.
Exactly.
Whoa.
And then they distilled it. They had homemade still somewhere. I never saw it.
Wow.
And then they manufacture and sell this to the Marines or the Army, whoever would be willing to buy it. The pictures now I want to tell you about, those pictures are in there. There were the Army guys, they were good entrepreneurs, and apparently they had access to photographic film and cameras and so forth. The Marines are not allowed a camera. And the reason for that is discipline. The Army is a public force, and many of them recruited during this period, and you might say they're more volunteers in the civilian line. But the Marines wouldn't allow cameras. So somebody had produced 54 pictures, and they were, I think, about the same size. Yeah, this is the size. They were black and whites, and I paid $10 for a set. I was making $21 a month plus $3 overseas pay. I paid $10. I figured that was worth it. And then the order came down, get rid of all the pictures. You can't have those. And going to New Zealand, we didn't know where we were going at the time. And I decided to keep them anyway. What can they do? I'm out there anyway. You know, they put you in the brig. Why you can't do any good for the Marine Corps. So I kept mine, thank goodness, because when I turned these pictures over, I lived in Texas in retirement with my wife for 23 years, and I was very beholden to Admiral Nimitz because I figured with his intelligence and Navy skills, he probably saved my life. And the Nimitz Museum was there. That's where he was born and raised. And the museum was there at the time, and now they expand that into another section. Another section is called the Naval Museum of the Pacific. So I went there. My wife and I went there when I first got to Texas, and we visited, and there was a quiz there. Have you ever had anything to do with Admiral Nimitz? And I wrote down that I had served where I did serve, and I had these pictures and so forth. So they wanted to see the pictures. And when they saw them, they went, they thought they were pretty nice, and I decided to donate them to Texas Parks and Wildlife. And so those documents are in here, and I've already received information that you can take those pictures, and I've signed them over, and you can use them if you give them the credit, as I understand it.
Okay.
That's in the letter I got from this place.
Okay, good. That's
I think that's
a detail we can attend to later. I know that Mrs. Buddha has been also in contact with them,
Oh.
so we'll organize that.
Yeah, they were willing to allow this if you give them a little credit along the way.
You bet.
So that's what how those pictures came into my possession. Nobody had pictures like this unless they got them that way.
Okay.
Now, the one interesting thing about it, I don't want to skip over, when I presented them to the museum at Fredericksburg, the curator there said, "This is amazing. We thought all of the Marines in the South Pacific went into combat with a new helmet." Now, that's the one that came down, and these pictures very clearly show the old Steel Kellys from World War I. That's what we wore when they first started firing at it.
Mm-hmm.
So they're in there when somebody got hit or killed, we'd use their helmet because it was more protective.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I got finally got a good helmet. That's what's ridiculous.
Guadalcanal has been seen as a U.S. force that had World War I weapons against a more well-equipped Japanese force because training hadn't gone on before Pearl Harbor. Was there any different feeling about going into Guadalcanal if you guys had more efficient equipment or things like that? Was there a different mood to fighting with
Never,
World War I
never
weapons?
thought of it.
Okay.
We just figured that was our job and we're gonna do it.
What was your experience island hopping? Do you have any specific stories about how that went around? This may have been talked about in your other questions, but specifically island hopping, what was that like? Just constantly
The
moving
island
between-
hopping?
Yeah.
Well, we knew that was a way to get to Japan, was to hit the islands, because we understood most of the islands had been occupied. And most of us were hoping that our management of the war would skip over some of them and bypass them to keep the killing and the wounding down to a lower level of the Americans. And that's what happened. Some of the islands were bypassed and they died on the mine, didn't have supplies, particularly after, I don't know if you may have studied this, some of the bases out there. This one big base, and I think of the name of it, but the Japanese set it up, and once that base was destroyed by our aircraft, they couldn't get supplies because that was the supply base for all these islands. And so a lot of starvation went on. In fact, the Japanese on our island, many of them starved. And we were lucky to have any food at all because the one admiral had written us off. It had been, I can't think of his name anymore, I didn't want to remember it. According to the literature, he had abandoned us, and Halsey came along, Admiral Halsey, under Nimitz, as a replacement, and decided they're not going to give up at Guadalcanal. We didn't know all this. We were just in the trenches, you know, boots on the ground. We just did what we were told. We didn't know the history of anything at the time, or didn't know this. We were not involved in the strategy or anything else. Now go ahead with the question.
What was the most frightening part of your service in the Pacific?
The most fighting part?
Frightening.
F-I-G-H-T-I-N-G?
Frightening. Scary.
Oh, frightening. See, I lost my hearing
Oh,
to the
sorry.
Jap. I didn't tell you about that one. That's the only casualty I had in my body, was the Japanese Navy, Imperial Navy, took my hearing away. The most frightening might have been that.
Was it just a constant artillery fire or bombing, or was it a one moment that you remember where you lost it?
It was every night that it happened, and it was terrifying. And I was when I lost my hearing, I was in this machine gun revetment. I had coconut logs topped over the top of it, and a hole dug in the sand, and we were protecting Henderson Field. The Japanese Navy owned the island at night because they had their Navy out there, and we couldn't send our aircraft off. We couldn't do any flying at night. And then in the morning, when our Hellcats, Wildcats, and P-38s could take off, then we'd chase them away, or they'd know to get away because they'd get bombed and strafed. So at night was terrifying. We never did get any sleep. And then sometimes the bombing would take place, but the naval shells were the worst part. And where I lost my hearing was, I was in a coconut grove. That's what why the British owned the island, was to produce coconut for their foreign trade. And the natives would be there, might say, employed. I like to tell you that because it's kind of interesting. If you want to pass on, it's okay.
Absolutely, go.
We're in this, the first night I was, you might say, terrified, was probably about 10 p.m. and Japanese Navy came in and started pumping shells on the Henderson Field about 2 miles away. Now these are naval shells. Some of them are as big as Volkswagen. And I don't know how big the one was. It was a short round. It hit the coconut trees up above us. And it absolutely raised everything up off. A good thing we're on sand because I don't think my body could have taken it. And the flash and the light in the sky was terrifying in a way, because this first night, the Japanese, the natives, the pictures are here of them in this book and then on the disc. the natives who worked on the plantation would come in and they were terrified by all this. And we were under the coconut law. They came in to get shelter. And they had their machetes, the one they knocked the coconuts down off the trees. We thought they're coming after us. So I nearly shot one of them, but I decided, and so did the others, I was with two other fellows in the revetment, that I just didn't want to take the chance on them because they might be on our side. Nobody told us they were even on the island. And anyway, we didn't kill them. And, but I can remember the flashes from the Japanese shells flashing off the machetes. And I lost my hearing. That's where I lost it. And I've been reading lips for about 50, 60 years and now have a hearing aid. I was lucky.
Wow, that is.
My son has
Very impressive.
as a paperweight the nose cone of one of the shells. It's about that big. I had it on my desk in my business for many years as a paperweight. When it was, if the logs hadn't been over, we'd all been dead, no question.
Wow.
Okay, that's enough of that one. Go ahead.
How did you stay in touch with your family, or were you able to when you were in the Pacific?
Say it again.
Were you able to stay in touch with your family when you were in the
Well,
Pacific?
this is semi-interesting. I didn't bring a copy along, but I still have it. I wasn't married at the time, and I communicated with my fiance and also my parents. And we used V-mail, V as in victory. And what they did to reduce the amount of weight on the troop ships was to reduce it photographically into a little, you write out a letter on something like this, and hopefully do a good job and get it all spaced properly. And then they shrink that down, and once it got to the other end and then it would be the other way in repeat, like a cameo performance. So letters I would get would come that same way. But I would normally get the reduced image because there was no equipment to reproduce it on our end. So we'd have to squint on there and always be the daylight because you couldn't see it at night. By the way, there was 5 cruisers lost. We're up in the hills firing. There were 4 American and 1 Australian cruiser, the Canberra. It was Vincennes, the Astoria, and the Australian cruiser Canberra. They were all sunk right off our coast, within 2 or 3 miles where I was. And the sky was so lit up with the battle between the U.S. Navy and the Japanese that I could take these letters out and read them because it was a low cloud cover, and the light from the flashes would bounce off the clouds and just illuminate. It was like daylight. It was probably midnight to 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And the Marines got their first order. Nobody knew what it meant. Was condition black. We always looked at it, what is that? We knew condition red, blue, white, and so on, what is black? That is, turn your weapons around and face the rear. We never had that one before. Well, we thought they might be landing, and they did land a lot of Japanese soldiers, and they come after us, but in this case, they didn't. We just turned around and started firing the other direction, up in the hill. Go ahead.
You had mentioned that it was 50 minutes of boredom and then 50 minutes of boredom and 10 minutes of terror. What would soldiers do to entertain themselves during the 50 minutes of boredom?
Absolutely nothing. We had nothing to read, no books to read. If a magazine just happened to stray by being mailed by somebody, and the mail service was really bad. It was actually before it got around to where you could still read it, was so dog-eared. Why there'd be fights over it. We had nothing to read, nothing at all. And the letters from home were the only thing we had. And the one friend that committed suicide over all this was from Springfield. I'd gone to boot camp with him. He got a Dear John letter where he and his bride-to-be was fine. They had their joint bank account and so forth. They're going to be married, and he was drafted. And he got a Dear John letter. I'm sorry, but I found somebody else, and here's a check for the remainder of so on and so on. So we was out on the beach in a rocky area. We just surf was coming in, and we don't know officially it'd be as not a suicide, but we think that most of his friends thought he committed suicide. That's the tragedy of all this, you know. And the Dear John letters would come frequently. We were I was overseas 3 years. I was in the Marine Corps 4 years, 3 months, 10 days, and 2 hours. So go ahead, please. Good question.
Do you recall the day that your service ended?
What day?
Yeah, what day you were released from service?
Oh, I have it on my discharge certificate.
What emotions, I guess?
November. I recall it very well. By that time, after 3 years, I'd come in, I had points at that time. I had accumulated X number of points for the number of months of service and how much combat time and so forth. I'd already had 2 combat tours. And so I had piled up the points. So after 3 years, I was allowed to come back. And it was all by ship at that time. And once I got to Treasure Island and went under the bridge, the Golden Gate, which is, you can't believe the phenomenal feeling about that after being away for 3 years under those conditions. And going to Treasure Island, San Francisco, that was a Navy base at the time. And then taking the train, it was a coach that had the gaslight area. They pulled it out of the museum, and the coupling broke between our coach and the rest of the train. They all pulled away. We all got out. We thought there might be another train coming along the single track, but they eventually knew what had happened, and they backed up and pulled us to L.A., transferred to another train, went to Kansas City, slept on the floor at the Union Station in Kansas City, and took the by that time I was on my 30-day furlough, and then took the Rock Island Railroad train to Muscatine, Iowa, which had a station there at the time for the trains that come in. My mom and dad and sister and my fiance to be, we had a pen pal romance, so that's why I hesitated there. This was not a down and give and deal. And we had a pen pal romance for 3 years. And so I popped the question to Jane in my parents' living room, and she said, yeah, everything moved fast at that time. You didn't have time to ponder, I wonder if he's the right one for me. I mean, it just was not that kind of a program. And we decided to get married, and we did. And we had gas rationing then when we got married in Danport, Iowa, because it's halfway between her town and Clinton, Iowa, and mine in Muscatine. And so that was splitting the difference, and my wife, to be Ann, had promised to allow us to, she sponsored the wedding in Davenport. That's what happened. We were married there. Then we honeymooned in Chicago 5 days, then back on the train to Muscatine, and 2 days later I took off, gave her a big kiss, and took off from the railroad station. And then Jean followed me to, I was sent to officer training school at that time, at Quantico, Virginia. And so she followed me later, and then I can tell you, there's not time, I can see there's not time for all that. Go ahead with your question.
At the end of your service, were you satisfied with what you had done with your service, and has that view of your service changed throughout the years?
Well, a view of my own service, and of course I've had hostility against the Japanese for what happened. 4 years out of my life, and I lost a lot of good friends, and I resent that. It has been ameliorated a little bit by the fact that by retirement home I met some pretty nice Japanese Americans, and that probably is a good thing for me. I think I'm by the age 90 plus, and I'm ridding myself of that. My wife and I visited 30 countries or more, and all together in our married life of 60 years. And I would never, even bring up Japan, and my wife knew why. I didn't want to go there. I just had that hostility. It's a good thing new people take over like you, because you get rid of all that garbage.
When your service ended, did you work? Did you go back to school? What were your activities directly after?
I went back to my former employer, Swift and Company, Chicago Stockyards, and I applied for my job. They wanted to send me and be there a week and a half from the time I was in Chicago to Kearney, Nebraska, and be in charge of the office accounting. I had not done accounting for 4 years, and they wanted me to go there because they were so bereft of employees at that time. So I said we'd get back to him, to this gentleman, and he was head of the accounting department. You can imagine the problems of having enough people to function in their plants at that time. And we went back to Muscatine, visited with my dad and mom and sister and friends, and talked about it. And I had a friend, this is networking, you might say, and I didn't know they called it then, but we built an alcohol plant to make butadiene into that's a synthetic rubber, make it into tires and other instruments of war. And if it hadn't been for that, we'd be saluting the Germans and Japs today. We had to have rubber. It was all cut off in Malaysia and Indonesia and other areas. Natural rubber was cut off. This was a phenomenal development that most people don't even know about. So this was an alcohol plant, and my owners of my company, the private owners, decided to buy the plant and manufacture alcohol after the war. And that's another story in itself. You don't have time for that. So I started to sell alcohol, grain neutral spirits, 190 proof. I was on the road, on the train again, to the East Coast, Hartford, Connecticut, Boston, New York City, and Elizabeth, New Jersey, and then back to Louisville and Chicago, where the rectifier and distillers were. They'd use the grain neutral spirits and cordials and liqueurs and blended whiskey. That's the extent of it.
Did your military experience affect the way that you view the military then or now?
No, not at all. I have a grandson who's on his second tour in the war zone. He's back there as he's a captain in the Army, and it did not affect me at all. I know that we have to have a strong military, and I don't resent this, but I really feel badly that we weren't prepared to go into World War II. Our opponents were totally armed, and we had nothing. And I don't think that was right. Now, don't forget, we had a lot of, if you study this, I presume you do, isolationism was our bag after. The cry was World War I, that's the end of it. That's a war that made all wars obsolete, but it didn't work that way. My wife's father was an artilleryman. I was an artilleryman. Now my grandson's an artilleryman with the U.S. Army. And my two sons didn't have to go, thank goodness. Now I kind of feel that I'm glad I did the service and they didn't have to go. Kind of figure that one out. Go ahead.
Is there anything that you would like to add that we have not covered in this interview so far?
Can't hear.
Is there anything that you would like to add that we've not covered in the interview so far?
I had some little interesting vignettes, but I don't think we've got time for all of them.
Well, how about one or two?
How much time?
5 minutes.
Oh. Well, I wonder what I've got. I was in the middle of assembling all this when I had to call. So I never even got to tell you about Saipan. I landed there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Saipan in the Marshall Group. And this is a strange story. I was in the hospital in Wellington, New Zealand, the Navy hospital, with my 8th case of malaria. And the medics decided I had to stay there because my troop ship was getting filled up, more than one troop ship, to go somewhere, we didn't know where. It turned out to be Tarawa and the Gilbert, which was devastating. I lost a lot of friends there. So this is where Siwash came in. I had this great story to tell you. The duck that we, and maneuvers in New Zealand, had picked up as a chick out in the boondocks, and we fed him beer, and they got to be a pal, and he went aboard the troop ship, not with me, I wasn't there. And he landed on the island, and I got these pictures of him sitting on a coconut log. It was in a Life magazine. My daughter-in-law researched this for you, and she paid $18 for all this, the Life, and the old Life magazine copies. And this is Siwash, and he was named that way because the guy that found him was from the state of Washington. That's what they call Washingtonians then. So he went aboard the ship, and he landed with the troops, and there's two pictures, and it shows him back at the Union Station. I got another one here showing the duck and Fagan. He came from South Chicago. I gone through boot camp with him. He was his mate, and taking him around on recruiting drive. And the picture I've got in here shows him, Fagan, at the Union Railroad Station downtown with his wife and two beautiful sisters, with the duck on the counter, and here's his Union Station right up above there.
Are those photos on the CD?
No.
Okay. Would you mind if we take some still photos?
If I can get them back, my
yeah, we just need to take them
daughter-in-law
with this video camera.
I never even got the
right now.
Saipan yet. So I don't think we have time for this, really.
Well, it sounds like we could use a whole extra interview with you, but this is about the time that we have for this first one. We've
It's
just
okay.
scratched the surface.
I've got plenty going for me. The interesting, this is how I remembered it all, was this, my dad and mom had clipped this out and had it in an album. And
So